Hi, folks. This is Dr. Diana Hill. I'm a clinical psychologist, host of the Wise Effort Show, and I'm on vacation. I reached out to a couple of podcasts that I've been interviewed on and asked if we could replay some of those episodes over here. First, because I want to introduce you to these podcasts if you aren't introduced to them yet. They're fantastic. This week, I'm sharing an interview on the Mindful Mama podcast. I love Hunter Clarke-Fields and everything that she is doing out there in terms of parenting. She's so practical, down to earth, relatable, and I hope you enjoy this conversation that I had with Hunter Clarke-Fields on the Mindful Mama podcast. Go check it out, and I think you'll really enjoy it. We talk about everything from parenting and ACT to our own upbringings, how they shaped us, and it's a really great personal and delightful conversation with Hunter Clarke-Fields.
So glad you're here. I'm excited to talk about ACT, acceptance, and commitment therapy. But we want to talk about it, of course, from the parenting point of view. And I just love to start out these conversations thinking about comparing what parenting may be like now versus what it may have been like then. And I'm wondering, how were you raised and what was your childhood like?
A mixed bag. I think that most people would say their childhood is a mixed bag. There were things that were super wonderful about it. My parents were quite eclectic folks. My mom actually grew up in Peru, and she was born in Dominican Republic, but grew up in Peru. And so there was a lot of influences of sort of South America in the way that she raised me, in the way sort of culturally, some of those influences. And then my dad was Buddhist, so I had that perspective as well. And they were both really big on nature and gardening. And so we were composting and we had a big vegetable garden in the backyard. So I have a lot of good memories about watering the garden after school and uh, being with my kind of what I thought at the time were weird parents. But now I appreciate all the lessons that they taught me. But those are, we also had, challenges as well. But they're still married, which is pretty cool, and I'm still pretty close with both of them.
Oh, cool, cool. What you thought they were weird? I'm sure, you were like mom's like from South America. She may do things like differently from the way maybe my friends are doing things, and dad's doing things differently. What were you worried about that was like weird when you were a kid the other kids wasn't happening in other families?
Yeah, well, first I wanna say my mom was an expat. She was an American in South America, so, but I will say one of the things that was different is I went to Catholic school. So she taught Spanish in a Catholic school, but we were not Catholic, and so some of the things that felt different for me was not like I would go to these rituals and ceremonies that were part of the Catholic school, things like First Communion, where you get to wear the really pretty white dress and, drink a little bit of wine and a little bit of communion. And I was different. I didn't get to stand in that line and wasn't part of that. I was often embarrassed when kids came over to my house because we were probably middle class, but at the school that we were going to was a private school where there was a lot of upper class kids that had things like Mercedes Benzes and Barbies that I didn't always have, and Barbies with Corvettes. And so there was I think sometimes, as many kids do, they just look at their differences or what makes what makes me different. And I think that early on, I learned to try and be like a high achiever, to try and fit in or stand out. That's where perfectionism and high achieving behavior started to creep in, which ended up being a double-edged sword for me. It really benefited me in a lot of ways, but then also had a dark side where I ended up developing an eating disorder when I was 14 or 15 years old and struggled with that for decades before I went on to be a clinical psychologist.
Wow. I can relate to so much of what you said because not what you're saying about your disorder, but I grew up in a super Catholic town. I grew up in Rhode Island. There's a huge Azorean Portuguese population. And we had so many people doing First Communion there was First Communion parade down the street. Everybody was Catholic. And I grew up in this my parents were agnostic. They kind of were rejecting their dad was Lutheran or whatever growing up and said we're tree huggers or whatever, I was definitely called weird. And I was definitely told someone told me, I remember in second grade, someone said well, do you believe in God? And I was like, well, I don't know. And they're like, well, if you don't know, then you don't believe in God and you're going to hell. And I was like, no. And it was very upsetting. But yeah, I remember going to church with someone and accidentally taking eating the wafer and because my parents were like, "Just do everything they do and you'll be fine." And the high achiever thing, I think that I mean, I don't know, you look somewhat similar age to me. Like, I think there was a time, right, where it was like, you know, we were very much praised for like there was like a self-esteem kind of movement kind of happening where you're like, "You're great, you can do wonderful." Like, I remember my grandfather gave me a dollar for every A I got, which didn't was I wasn't super impressed with in high school, but by, like, 4th grade, I was super psyched about that, and, just this, like, emphasis on achievement, and I definitely could feel that, like, it's important for me to get those grades, like, that was a really important thing, I don't know, that message came through for me loud and clear as well.
Yeah. My husband, he has his PhD in education, and his favorite line is they're gonna school the smarts right out of you, which is that I sort of that concept of the focus on achievement and the focus on the grade and the consequences to the child that loses the love of learning or loses the process of learning and the exploratory nature of what is it that you enjoy? What is it that you don't enjoy? What are you curious about? The mistakes that happen that are growth areas. And so I became really quite rigid as a result of being a high achiever and that rigidity, it still shows up from time to time with me now where I lose sort of focus on what's important to me or what about sort of the process of my life because I'm so focused on trying to get to some goal. And it's sort of a never-ending finish line, right? So as soon as I get there, the finish line is already moved forward. And that happened academically for me early on, but now it happens like with parenting or with my private practice or book writing or whatever other things that I'm engaged in. And it's a really dangerous path. In Buddhism, it would be considered samsara, which is the cycle of suffering, where you're just constantly trying to get at something, grasp at something, but it never really makes you feel satisfied.
Yeah, the hungry ghost, right? And you're in the realm of the hungry ghost where you're eating and you can't take it in your tiny throat. Um, do you think that like the perfectionism, like and all this achievement, do you think it was like this, you know, and and maybe even the eating disorder, right? Like, is this like, do you think this is like an attempt to kind of control a world that feels really uncontrollable? Like as you sort of grow up and you realize like how vast it is and how little control of it we have.
I view it sort of through a biopsychosocial spiritual lens. So there is an element about it, something like an eating disorder that's biologically, genetically. We know anorexia is what I struggle from. We know there's a close to 50% concordance rate, which means if you have two biological twins, there's a 50% chance that the other one's going to get anorexia if the first one has anorexia. So there is a genetic predisposition to, I think, something like an eating disorder, but also to things like rigidity or having more of a conscientious sort of personality style and or anxiety sensitivity. And then there's the social cultural aspect of things where we're getting reinforced for certain types of behaviors and other types of things are not getting reinforced. So you're getting an A when you get your spelling test right and that feels good, right? So there's the social cultural focus on certain body shapes and sizes as being privileged or prioritized. And then there's also the aspect of an act we call experiential avoidance, which is if I can control this thing, if I can control my weight, or I can control my grades, or I can control the cleanliness of my house, or I can control, all sorts of things, then I'm really attempting to control the thoughts and feelings and sensations that are underneath my skin that I don't like, and that may be things like feelings of inadequacy, or feelings of anxiety, or feelings of shame, or feelings of sadness, which are naturally going to happen to all of us across our childhood and across our lifespan. And for me, I didn't know what to do with those feelings. And it just seems simpler to, you know, count my calories or get straight A's than actually go into that underworld and that mystery and that wilderness of all the stuff that shows up under our skin and tends to get pretty intense during adolescence in particular. And then, a lot of us don't have the tools of what do we do when that shows up?
Yeah, I guess they're like coping skills kind of gone awry, right? Like they're coping skills that help you manage and help you kind of get through the day and then it gets kind of it gets kind of out of control. Like as I remember for me, a really positive coping skill was like going for a run, and I would run without headphones, and I learned to run in high school, and I would run in college and stuff like that, and it would just be a big release, and it would be a really healthy coping skill. But like I could see how it could go into, you know what I mean? If anything left to extreme, right, goes awry and in this way.
And it can become a bit of like a whack-a-mole situation. So if running is what helps you get rid of your anxiety, then whenever anxiety shows up, I need to go for a run, right? But what if anxiety is showing up twice a day? Are you going to start running twice a day? What if it shows up 3 times a day? And we see this with other types of avoidance behaviors, right? So maybe it's not running, but maybe it's I need to take an Ativan or drink a glass of wine, or when my anxiety shows up, I need to, organize my house, or that these types of experiential avoidance strategies, which tend to be about getting rid of feelings or thoughts or sensations that happen under our skin, end up having this rebound effect. So the feelings come back. Sometimes they come back even stronger. And we end up being sort of our lives are directed by what we're avoiding as opposed to what we want. So there's lots of reasons to run. We may run because it gives us a little mood boost. I love to run because it's a nice way to just get outside and breathe and be with my thoughts and be out in nature and take a break from all of the chaos of my family life and my work life. And that's different than I'm running to get rid of my anxiety. So in ACT, we really make this distinction between, are you moving in a direction that's in line with your values, that brings you vitality, that opens up your life, that helps you be the type of person that you want to be in the world? Or are you moving away from that because you're trying to avoid something that's uncomfortable? And oftentimes, the things that bring us vitality in life, or the direction we want to head in our lives, include some degree of discomfort. And it's actually the skill and the ability to be with and open up to the discomfort of living and holding it with compassion while we move in directions that matter to us, that really kind of opens us up. So it's been an interesting journey. I mean, I ran a treatment center for eating disorders. I first started studying DBT for bulimia, and I worked with Deborah Safer at Stanford and researching that.
Just explain what DBT is for the listener.
So DBT, I would say DBT is, it's one of the cognitive behavioral therapies, but it was one of the first ones that brought in acceptance and it was developed by Marsha Linehan, who was also a Zen practitioner. And so she brought in a lot of principles around, it's not just about changing your thoughts or changing your feelings. It's also the power of accepting what is, and radical acceptance, like complete radical acceptance. It also has a lot of other skills, like interpersonal effectiveness skills, how to assert yourself, mindfulness skills. It was one of the early acceptance-based approaches. They call them third wave psychologies. And so I started there researching that, and then found my way to ACT from there, which is sort of a sister of DBT. It's not quite as structured as DBT is, and it has this extra component of values, what you want your life to be about. And ended up running a treatment center for eating disorders for a while before I went into private practice. I'm not solely in eating disorders anymore, but I really find these principles are useful for any of us that struggle with trying to control or find ourselves moving in directions that we don't want to be moving in, maybe as parents or as partners or just as people on this planet, how to be with what's uncomfortable and being with the uncertainty of things while turning towards the type of person you want to be.
Beautiful. I love that. So when going back to your own life, like how did you end up getting pet moving beyond your eating disorder when you were young?
Oh my gosh, it's a long, windy story. So it was 14, 15. We went to a treatment center and came back, and then I developed bulimia. And in my 20s, I ended up getting really involved in the work of Thich Nhat Hanh. My dad was a practitioner. His teacher was Thich Nhat Hanh. And so I went to Plum Village when I was 2001. So I think I was just barely 20. And that started opening Plum Village is his monastery in France, where he was in exile in France. And that opened the door to me of just a different way of living, of practicing mindfulness. And I got really involved in yoga. So that was sort of the start of, when I say biopsychosocial spiritual, that was a spiritual component of my recovery that still is a thread through my recovery and a thread in a lot of my work that I do of this foundation of mindfulness and the foundation of sort of yogic principles of effort and surrender. And but it wasn't a straight path. I don't think a lot of people's recovery from addictions is. I mean, we hear this we see the story on People magazine of like, recovered from whatever, alcoholism or recovered from an eating disorder. But it's much more of a labyrinth than that. It has a lot more twists and turns. So I ended up going into graduate school to study with Linda Craighead. Um, and I was studying appetite awareness, which is how to bring awareness to your physical hunger and fullness and use that as a guide for your eating. So that's the biological component of the biopsychospiritual model, right? That's a whole biology around listening to your body and feeding your body. And when I was in graduate school, my first year of graduate school, I relapsed into my eating disorder. So I'm a PhD student studying eating disorders, and I relapsed, which is a massive, shameful, scary experience. And so I withdrew. I ended up withdrawing and saying, I'm willing to let this all go because my recovery is the most important thing. And how do I possibly work with other people if I'm struggling, actively struggling with my eating disorder? And I went to a yoga ashram. And that's when I got really clear. I went to El Dorado Mountain Yoga in Boulder. I thought I was going to be a yoga teacher, and then decided, wait a minute, I want to be able to go back and bring all this stuff that I know has been really useful to me, but have it really marry with and integrate with what's happening in the academic world. And that I don't have to choose, because I felt like I had to choose. I felt like I either had to choose to be this researcher, academic self that is perfect, or I'm like meditating in an ashram somewhere wearing yoga pants all day and, you know, often my spiritual journey. And that's been the practice for me since then, is where do I find this integration, and also the integration of some of the biological stuff like nutrition and you know intuitive eating and appetite awareness and all of that. And that's when I came back and found Deborah Safer, who was doing DBT at Stanford, and she was really inspiring to me, and she came on as another mentor. So that was part of I guess my recovery in some ways was also my career path.
Oh my god, I can relate so much to everything you said. I studied with Thich Nhat Hanh, and I went on retreat with him and my 6-year-old daughter, and the last time he was in North America, and yeah, and just, like, even, like, I'm not I don't think I ever had, like, an eating disorder. I had, like, a sugar problem. I had, a sugar addiction. I would, like it's kind of ridiculous, like, my roommates would find raisins, like, in all the cushions of the couches because I just was, like, trying to, like, replace the sugar need but, like, it was body awareness. It was, like, yoga, that and being able to find that, like, I guess I relate to that feeling of, like, finding that feeling of, like, what does your body need, that satiety feeling, of fullness and things like that. Anyway, sorry, there's this, like I was like, "Oh, yes, I relate to so much of your story." And I think that's so beautiful that you took that and, you explored these different avenues and then found a place where it was all coming together, and I can definitely see that in the work that you do, the acceptance and commitment therapy work that you do, because it really brings together all these, like, different pieces of well, you tell me about, like, how it brings together these different pieces.
Well, ACT is an approach to not necessarily getting rid of symptoms. It's about building a life that is in line with your values. And so sometimes that means your anxiety doesn't go away. It might come back. Actually, I have like a low grade anxiety. Sometimes it's stronger, sometimes it's weaker. Um, it's not super strong right now in this moment with you, Hunter, but I'll say, yesterday it was pretty intense towards the end of the day when I was worrying about something. So with ACT, it's not about, necessarily trying to control or get rid of any of those types of symptoms. That it doesn't even see sort of pathologize people that have struggles, that all humans struggle in different ways. We all experientially avoid. We all don't like feeling things. And so we do all sorts of stuff to not feel things. But what it offers you is this path to what's called psychological flexibility. And psychological flexibility is your ability to stay open to what's happening in the present moment, your thoughts, feelings, and sensations, to stay aware, which is aware, like to be an observer, to step into an observer state, aware of what's happening, and then engaged with your values. So to be able to really take action with your hands and feet in a way that's aligned with your heart. And it has these 6 core processes that support that psychological flexibility. So, for example, with parenting, psychological flexibility in parenting, I was just working with a client right before meeting with you, and they were talking about bedtime and how they've gotten into this routine now where their 3-year-old requires 6 stories,
Oh my gosh.
2 songs, and then 1 story that's made up by the parent in the dark after the lights are out.
After all that, boy.
Right, right. And I'm like, "Okay, well, who," it's like with it, when you see a dog that's being, like, dragging their owner on a leash down the street, and you're like, "Who's walking who here?" And I'm like, "Who's putting who to bed here?" So what's happening there? Like, how did the parent get there? How did you get there to 6 stories and 2 songs and I got there because I really don't like the feeling of guilt when I say, "Bedtime's," "story time is over, time to go to bed now," and I feel guilty because I was working, or I feel guilty because, I just have a chronic state of parental guilt. Or I really don't like the feeling of, the sound of my child whining, and then it makes me, I just want that whining to stop, so I threw in another story. Or I also maybe have some memories of, my parents who did not read to me, and that feeling of loneliness or feeling of, isolation at bedtime and feeling scared, right? So in that moment, what's happening is that some rules are showing up for this client. I made all of that up. So this is not what's true for this client. I just made it up. Some rules might be showing up for this person, some stories, some memories. This is all stuff that's showing up, that's choosing for them, like a dog pulling at them, their actions. And what this parent really wants, or what a parent really wants, is to enjoy bedtime with their kids and connect. And if you're forced into reading 6 stories, 2 songs, and a story at bed, in the dark, you actually start to resent, or maybe dread, or not like, or not feel like you're being the parent that you want to be. So with ACT, what you would be doing is you'd be opening up to those feelings, noticing those thoughts, aware, oh, there's my guilt. That's my mom guilt or my dad guilt. It tends to show up a lot, doesn't it? And then choose to engage with your values. And what is the type of parent that I want to be in this moment? What are the limits that I want to set? What is the warm heartedness I want to bring? What is the compassionate voice I want to use while I'm setting those limits? And that would be you acting in line with your values, even with those difficult sensations showing up for you. So that is an example of psychological flexibility, and those processes, these 6 core processes that support that we can break down and teach people how to use them and practice them.
I would love to break them down, and I love that example. I really appreciate you sharing that example with us because it's such a great example of, boundaries needed, right? Because that parent's needs are, you know, both the parent and the kid's needs are important, right? They're right there. There's a conflict of needs, and it's like, how do we say, I hold a boundary, right? And holding a boundary really involves a lot of the time, like being able to experience the discomfort of like, "Oh, hello, old guilt. I see you there," or the discomfort of the whining and just get through the whining at a certain point, or the discomfort of saying no and having your child be unhappy with a no. And that's sometimes the right decision in those moments. And we have to go through the experience of discomfort in order to be able to hold to our boundaries and act on them, and I love that. So it's this idea of being able to experience this. You were talking about this experience, being able to experience these feelings, feel the feelings, and that's whole that mindfulness piece, right? Of like then being able to, like, if the feelings are like the waterfall, then you're stepping out in front of the waterfall, you're looking at it and saying, "Oh, okay. This is what it is." And now I have the ability to choose because I'm not just like under the waterfall of the feelings, right? So this is a profound practice.
And it's about flexibility and values. Those are the sort of cornerstones of it, because sometimes it's holding the boundary, because holding the boundary helps me live out my values right now in this moment as a parent. Sometimes it's getting way more flexible with your boundary. So last night, my version of bedtime is it's late. I have a teen and a 10-year-old, a 13 and a 10-year-old, and it's basketball playoffs and the Lakers are playing. And I have two boys that are really into the Lakers we're down to the end here, right? Fourth quarter and the Lakers are coming back. Am I going to go in and be like, 8 o'clock kids, turn off the TV. It's a school night, right? Even though I really want to, even though I want to go to bed. I'm tired. Let's end this now. I don't really care that much about basketball, right? So that's also a moment where how can I be more flexible as a parent and tolerate the I'm stretching my limits here in the service of, hey, fun. I kind of want to be a fun mom. That's actually a value of mine. Is and not always an easy one for me to live out. I lean a little bit towards being unfun. My husband's more the fun parent. I'm the like keep everyone in line parent, right?
Wow. Another place I relate with you, Diana. I am the hard ass as well in my family.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So I can practice flexibility around that, but it's because I have clarity around what is the value that I am putting at the forefront. And I like to think about that as sort of like, you like Rubik's cubes, so there may be one value that's, like one color that you are working on because it's something that's important to you. It's how you want to show up in your parenting. Maybe you want to be more fun, or maybe you want to be more soft and flexible, or maybe you want to be more creative, or maybe you want to be more truthful. Some parents aren't super truthful, and that's a value that they have, right? That's sort of the top of the Rubik's cube that you practice, and then you also have all these other values on the other sides that you're balancing out, and sometimes you need to bring one to the forefront. So last night I let my kids stay up late and watch a basketball game, and now I have a sick kid at home. But I don't think it's related to staying up late. I think he was already getting sick. But yeah, so it's freeing when you see parenting as driven by your values because you can be more flexible. And it's also freeing when you don't have to have your behavior so coupled to your thoughts and to your feelings. You can have a feeling and you don't have to act on that feeling. You can have a thought and like a guilty thought or I'm a bad parent thought or whatever, and you don't have to act on that thought. And that's what psychological flexibility gives us is that freedom.
I love that. It's freeing to have your behavior not be coupled to your thoughts necessarily. That's so true. But it's also in some ways harder, right? Like what you're describing is a middle path, right? You're describing a kind of messy middle, right? Like freedom and flexibility is also means like I have to stop and, like, think about all this. I have to stop and tap into my values and process this whole thing, right? Like, I think a lot of times parents, we want, like, a rule, right? Like, this is the thing. This is what we do. If we go to, like, extremes, it's always this or it's always this. It's easier, right? It's easier to kinda be in the extremes than it is to be in the messy middle.
Well, it's sort of the analogy that I have. I think people might get tripped up that there's actually already a knowing inside of you, that you have a knowing of like sort of like tuning a guitar. When you tune in and you really just check in with yourself, what is in alignment for me? What do I really know to be true for me as a parent about what's important right now or what I care about right now? What works for me as a parent is going to be different from the parent that is picking up their kid at school right next to me. And that's okay. And so values are personal and they're chosen. And when we start to look within and notice how it feels in our body, like what does it feel like when you have a day, like if you look back over the course of this day, yesterday, and you were like, yeah, that was a moment where I feel like I really showed up. And it felt like it was a meaningful moment or a connecting moment, or I feel good and proud of how that parenting moment went. That's an indicator of what your values are. So it doesn't have to be, I mean, I think in the Act Daily journal that Debbie and I wrote, we get really structured and it's helpful to have that kind of structure. And then it's also helpful just to basically tune in, like check in with yourself. So you can check in and say, okay, what right now in this moment, what's most important to me? How do I want to show up as a parent? And what would be the next sort of move in terms of my behavior? What is the quality that I want to bring to my behavior?
For me, that makes me all reflect completely upon like the mindfulness practices, the awareness practices, like the practices that have, for me have built my awareness of my body and then my awareness of my thoughts and my mind and my heart over the last 15 years or whatever, right? Like that that allows me to do this, right? Like, because I practice that all the time, so it allows me to do this. But I want to hear from you, like, what about the act? Like, what are the 6 core processes? Can you walk us through those?
Yeah. So the 6 core processes together develop psychological flexibility. The first one is exactly what you're talking about, Hunter, which is being present, being mindful. The second one has to do with acceptance. And acceptance is not necessarily accepting something outside of you, but really allowing for and opening up to whatever's happening in this moment, the reality of what is. The third process has to do with how we relate to our thoughts. In an act, they use a word called cognitive diffusion. And that's that decoupling thing that I was talking about, which is you're going to have thoughts all the time. You're having thoughts, Hunter, as we're doing this interview. I'm having thoughts. Some of the thoughts may be related to the interview, some may not. The listeners are having thoughts. Some of those thoughts may be judgmental, critical, helpful, random. With cognitive diffusion, you start to just notice your thoughts as thoughts without trying to control or change them. And then, some thoughts may be helpful. The fourth process has to do with your relationship with yourself, perspective taking. So the ability to get behind the eyes of another person, the ability to take perspective on your own self, the ability to transcend sort of the small self and feel that interconnected nature of, our interbeing is what Thich Nhat Hanh would call it. So that is another process that can be really helpful. It's the common humanity aspect of Kristen Neff's self-compassion that when we are parenting, we're not alone. There is our lineage of ancestors, of parents before us, and then there's all the other parents that are parenting right now in this moment as well. And so you don't feel so alone in yourself. And then the fifth process has to do with values, which we've talked a lot about, the qualities that you want to bring to your life. And then the very last one is committed action. So ACT is behavioral psychology. It means, not just thinking about these things, but actually doing them. What are you committing to in this moment that demonstrates psychological flexibility and your values? And so we work with people a lot in terms of committed action. And those 6 core processes are how we structured the ACT Daily Journal. It's how I structure my courses. I have an online course on ACT. And I also talk about them a lot on my podcast of just sometimes it's helpful to focus on one at a time because there's so much going on there.
Awesome. I love that. Diana, thank you so much for coming on the Mindful Mama podcast and sharing your time with me. It's been really a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I so appreciate you sharing your story and being open and with everything with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Wise Effort podcast. Wise Effort is about you taking your energy and putting it in the places that matter most to you. And when you do so, you'll get to savor the good of your life along the way. If you would like to become a member of the Wise Effort podcast, go to wiseeffort.com. And if you like this episode and think it would be helpful to somebody, please leave a review over at Podchaser. I would like to thank my team, my partner in all things, including the producer of this podcast, Craig, Ashley Hyatt, the podcast manager, and thank you to Ben Gold at Bell & Branch for our music. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and it's not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatments.